Okay, in the last few slides we have gone through what I would call the background or the underpinning facts and figures that you need to understand in order to develop a fatigue risk management system. The rest of the program will focus on some fairly practical aspects of what I need to do in my organisation, what are the key factors that I need to be thinking about, and what would a fatigue risk management system in an organisation look for, and what would it look like. So, what we're going to talk about now are the major or the key elements of a fatigue risk management system. There are four key elements to a fatigue risk management system. The first is that you've got to have a plan. There has to be some kind of basic underpinning fatigue risk management system, policy document or plan. Without that, the organisation doesn't know what it's doing and nobody can work out if you're doing what you said you were going to do. That being said, many organisations fail to see the difference between their enterprise bargaining agreement and their fatigue risk management system. It's important to understand in an organisation that shift from industrial relations based approaches to occupational health and safety processes needs to be reiterated at the organisational level. One of the things that most shapes how an organisation thinks about fatigue management will be where they position the fatigue risk management policy documents. Our advice to organisations is that they should be focused almost entirely within the occupational health and safety domain and as little as possible within the industrial relations domain. If you wanted to put that into a simple phrase, that we would say an organisation that manages fatigue well understands a very simple principle. That is, fatigue is a safety hazard with industrial relations implications, not an industrial relations issue with occupational health and safety implications. So achieving that shift away from an industrial perspective towards a safety perspective is the critical element. And one of the most important ways that you can actually achieve that is to make sure that the policy architecture for fatigue management sits within the occupational health and safety documentation of the organisation and maybe potentially cross-references industrial documents. But it should sit clearly and distinctly within an occupational health and safety domain. Or the second key element of a fatigue risk management system is people need to know that there is a fatigue management policy, and most importantly, they need to understand what are the roles and responsibilities for individuals within the organisation and what are they personally responsible for. In order to ensure that people know what are theirs and the organisation's roles and responsibilities, there needs to be some form of training and education program. Depending on which industry or organisation you work for, they can be from simple awareness programs through to quite comprehensive competency-based approaches. What is relevant for the particular industry you're working with or the industry that you're consulting to will depend on where that industry is in that developmental trajectory. At the moment, within the transport sector, there are actually specified curriculum under AQF, and we'll talk about those a little later. In some organisations, it may be simply an awareness of the policy, something that happens in induction and some general awareness training. What the organisation requires, what are the legal obligations, and what are best practice for the organisation are something that will need to be determined in context. The third element of a fatigue risk management system is the compliance system for ensuring that an employee is fit for duty. We're going to spend a lot of time in the rest of the course going through the systems, procedures, policy and practice around that. But there are a number of key points that you need to focus on as you start that journey. The first is, in determining whether somebody is or is not fit for duty, you need a credible risk assessment system. The second is that you need credible risk controls. And you need to make sure that those risk controls are appropriate for your organisation, your staff, and their level of maturity from an occupational health and safety perspective. The fourth element of the fatigue risk management system is some form of audit or compliance system for ensuring that the FRMS is operating as specified. That is, here's how we're going to manage fatigue and here's how you can check whether we're doing what we said we did. For those of you who come from a safety background, you'll realise that these are the same four elements that form the basis of any hazard management system. And going back to what we talked about before, you remember that catch cry, fatigue is just another hazard. What we're trying to do is to mainstream fatigue and deal with it just like every other hazard. So you will require a policy, training and education, a compliance system for ensuring that people are fit for duty, and then lastly a process for ensuring that you're doing what you said you're doing and that the system is actually working as specified. Looking at detailed policy documentation for a specific organisation is probably beyond the scope of this particular course. You will find in the course materials that we give you some template or some example fatigue management policy documents, and it is quite useful to go through these and to see how different organisations have dealt with the issue. I'd also make the comment that different organisations have different document cultures, and in many cases it's really important for that document around fatigue to fit with the rest of the document structure for the organisation. So what we're going to talk about in this course is some of the general principles around the fatigue risk management system, and particularly around the specific definition of legal responsibilities and accountabilities. However, while you can understand the principles and while you can look at the template documents, I think there is some danger in slavishly using Microsoft Word to just substitute in a different organisational name. Our experience has been that these templates are useful, they start a discussion, but that organisations should use their standardised reporting frameworks and structures, their normal policy architecture, and define fatigue within that in the same way as they have for every other hazard. Everything you can do to mainstream fatigue and make it just like every other hazard will probably increase the likelihood that that will be managed. The first point that I'd like to talk about in terms of defining a fatigue management or a fatigue risk management policy is understanding who is responsible for what. In this slide we outline the three pillars or the three foundation stones of responsibility for fatigue management. You will see that we have divided this into three areas. That is, there are two management responsibilities and one employee responsibility. You will also notice that we do not define shift durations or shift lengths or hours per week or per shift or any of the normal compliance style data that many guidance materials around fatigue are focused on. In this particular aspect of the documentation, we focus on defining who is responsible for what. And as you will see, the first legal responsibility is assigned to management. And in effect, we say that management is responsible for ensuring that the working time arrangement provides you a sufficient sleep opportunity in order to be fit for the next work shift. That is, that's a very performance-based approach to this issue. That is, the job of management to work out is, are we providing you with an adequate opportunity to rest and recover? The second legal responsibility is the employee responsibility. As we spoke about earlier, one of the key issues for fatigue management, compared with many other hazards, is the importance of a shared responsibility framework. While it is perfectly reasonable to expect an organisation to provide the employee with an adequate sleep opportunity, it is not reasonable for an organisation to be responsible for ensuring that that opportunity is used appropriately. So you will see here that we have used the statutory requirement for an employee to say that an employee's responsibility is to use their sleep opportunity, that is their time away from work, in order to obtain sufficient sleep in order to work safely. And in the event that they haven't been able to gain sufficient sleep, that they have an obligation to let somebody know so the risk can be managed. One of the things that's quite important to think about when you're talking about fatigue at an organisational level is it is unreasonable to expect an organisation and its managers to manage a risk of which they are unaware. And unfortunately, in many cases, the only person who is aware of the risk is the employee themselves. And that goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, self as hazard. Fatigue is quite an important example of self as hazard and the need for people to be able to determine whether they are fit for duty or not. We'll talk more about this later, but it is very difficult for somebody to determine whether they are fit for work or not based on a personal self-assessment. One of the difficulties with fatigue is an unverifiable internal psychological state. We'll talk about more on how you can actually approach the problem of identifying fatigue, but for the purposes of where we are at the moment, it's important to understand that the legal responsibility for identifying inadequate sleep due to a failure to use the sleep opportunity appropriately is ultimately the employee's responsibility. Most importantly, in the event that there is an accident and an employee failed to notify, employees need to understand that they are potentially liable in those circumstances. We have done a lot of work over the last couple of years talking to organisations, talking to lawyers, talking to occupational health and safety people, and the question has often arisen, can an employee be held responsible for an occupational health and safety accident? And while there is no doubt that the number of prosecutions are relatively low, we expect that that will change in the future, particularly where we have an increasing emphasis on shared responsibility. The third responsibility around fatigue, and this is again another management responsibility, states that management is responsible for providing clear guidelines on how to respond to an incident where somebody identifies themselves as at risk for fatigue. That is, management's responsible for providing you with an adequate sleep opportunity. You're responsible for using that opportunity to gain sufficient sleep, and in the event that that hasn't happened, letting somebody know. But management is responsible for ensuring that when somebody does let them know, that that's actually managed in a fair and reasonable manner. You can't have a system where somebody puts up their hand and identifies themselves at risk and they're told to toughen up, princess, or, you know, if you want to work here tomorrow, you aren't tired anymore. It's very important that there are clear, unambiguous guidelines that sit within a just culture framework and that are risk and safety management system compliant, so that when somebody does put their hand up, you are in a position to manage that risk. It doesn't mean that somebody doesn't work, but it does mean that there are probably tasks that you wouldn't want them to do fatigued, that you may be quite happy for them to do if they were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So, to summarise, there are 3 clear legal responsibilities as part of your fatigue management documentation. The management responsibility is to provide an adequate opportunity to sleep. The employee responsibility is to ensure that that opportunity is used, and in the event that it's not, which can happen for perfectly reasonable and understandable reasons, that if you do put up your hand and identify an elevated level of risk, that management knows how to manage that, and that is drilled down into the organisation such that line managers and supervisors don't see it as an opportunity to engage in hairy-chested management. The second element of a fatigue risk management system is the necessary training and education. In some cases, people think training and education around fatigue means handy hints for shift workers. It certainly includes that, but it also needs to cover more than that. At the moment, at least within the formal AQF or Australian Qualifications Framework, there are a number of fatigue management courses, and those curriculum are well established, validated, and in many cases we recommend to organisations to use them. If we start at the lowest level, these are within the Transport, Logistics and Infrastructure Framework at Cert 2. There is a course that's been developed initially for truck drivers but is being used by a lot of industries at the moment, and that's typically directed towards employees who are at risk of being fatigued themselves. In a sense, this is the equivalent of the old handy hints for shift workers kind of documentation, and shows people a range of issues around how to best use their sleep opportunity in order to gain sufficient sleep in order to be fit for work. So this covers a lot of issues, some of them related to how to get a good night's sleep, some of them about diet and exercise, a lot of it about understanding the basic elements of the sleep system. But while this is important, it's not the only aspect of training and education that's important for organisations to think about. For example, most organisations will have a fatigue management or a fatigue risk management policy. Employees will need to be aware of the policy. They will need to understand their roles and responsibilities. They will have to sign off on the fact that they have read and understood the policy as well as done the training and education. So it's important, even at this Cert 2 level, to realise that those curriculum form part of the training agenda, but not necessarily all of it. Again, one of the things to think about as an organisation is the extent to which you document people's involvement. Is the course going to be assessed? Will it be competency-based? Will it be attendance-based? Again, there aren't simple answers to these questions, and normally you can seek advice from somebody who is familiar with the industry and understands what is typically required of people. You can do this at a minimal standard, or you can go for best practice. We would generally recommend to organisations that if you are going to use established curriculum, it's not unreasonable to assess them, and if you are going to assess them, that should be a competency-based rather than an attendance-based assessment. The second level of training, and again this sits within the Transport, Logistics and Infrastructure framework, is targeted at supervisors and staff who determine the working times of others. So typically this would be a dispatch person in a trucking company, it may be a crew rostering person in the rail industry, it may be somebody responsible for allocating overtime in the power industry for emergency workers, it may be somebody within the hospital who sets doctors' or nurses' working hours. But what this curriculum recognises is that there's certain things that you need to understand when you are responsible for assigning work to others that go beyond what we learnt in the Cert 2 course. Now, for those people who undertake the Cert 3 course, the Cert 2 course is the basic starting point, and then you, in a sense, upgrade or top up into the Cert 3 program. Again, for many organisations, the Cert 3 course under AQF is the desired or preferable option. One of the things that we think about with these courses is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to pay a lot of money for well-established curriculum, and in many cases there are a number of providers in the workplace who are prepared to provide either web, video or classroom-based approaches to this that can be reasonably cost-effective. In general, we would suggest the use of these courses can be achieved at much less cost than typically using university-based consultants such as myself, who can cost thousands of dollars a day as distinct to hundreds of dollars a day. The third level of training that's available is the Graduate Certificate in FRMS, which is offered by CQU and for which, if you're watching this, you're probably enrolled in. This is a course that is specifically directed towards safety professionals who are responsible for managing fatigue and in the development, implementation and evaluation of a fatigue risk management system in their workplace. This has increasingly been a requirement for organisations who are looking for greater degrees of flexibility in how they manage fatigue, and the regulatory concern that if you are to develop a more flexible system, that the people involved in the development, implementation and the evaluation of the system should understand something about the topic. For those of you who are involved in the Grad Cert course, this is a very new development, and it's only in the last year or so that regulatory agencies are starting to insist that people do have some kind of formal occupational qualification in safety in general and fatigue management in particular. You may remember that the first two elements of a fatigue risk management system were the policy documentation and the training and education program. The third element is some form of compliance system that enables you to determine whether an individual is fit for work, or in the event that they're not, what the level of risk is and what would be the appropriate controls to put in place to manage that. As we said before, we try to approach this using a multi-leveled control system based on the principles outlined by James Reason. If you look at this slide, you'll see that we have adopted those general principles of Jim Reason's and assembled them into a hazard control model. On the left-hand side of the model, you will see two boxes. These correspond to what Jim has typically referred to as latent errors or active errors. And then within that box, you will see that there are 5 levels of control. We've gone back systematically through the research literature, both in terms of identifying the risk and the types of controls that will be typically put in place. And what we've done is tried to allocate all of the different approaches and techniques that we have found to each of these 5 levels. This has been a somewhat fortuitous process, and we were kind of lucky in the sense that we came up with a set of labels for each of these levels that seems to work particularly well. If you look at the centre of the diagram, you will see that there is a triangle that's divided into 5 specific layers. This forms the general hazard control model that we will use for determining whether somebody is fit for work, and if they're not fit for work, what the level of risk is and what would be the appropriate controls to put in place. If we look at level 1, you will see that it is around the principle of determining sleep opportunity. As we've said before, the primary control that most organisations use is to determine the level of sleep opportunity that people are provided with using, for example, rules of rostering. The roster is the primary mechanism for determining that people are provided an adequate sleep opportunity. We'll also go on to talk about the fact that there are other approaches to this, particularly those around computer-based analysis of shift schedules. But by and large, either compliance with a set of rules of rostering or analysis using some kind of biomathematical model are the primary way in which we determine whether we have provided people with an adequate opportunity to sleep. These are sometimes referred to as level 1 controls, and after we've gone through this overview of the hazard control model, we will systematically look at each of these potential layers of control and the technologies that are available for you to use within your organisation. So, as we said, the primary control that we will use is to ensure that people are provided an adequate sleep opportunity, and this corresponds to that first legal responsibility we saw in the previous section. But an adequate sleep opportunity, while necessary, is not sufficient to ensure that somebody is fit for duty. So you will see that the second level control that we have in place here is about the amount of sleep that an individual is obtaining. In order to be fit for duty, you have to be provided with an adequate sleep opportunity, and you have to actually use that sleep opportunity to obtain sufficient sleep in order to work the next shift safely. And as we said in that previous slide, that level of control is the primary responsibility of the employee. So you will see here that there are 2 key principles we've articulated in our fatigue management document. That is management's responsibility to provide an adequate sleep opportunity, and that's reflected in the level 1 controls, and then employees' responsibility to identify whether they are fit for duty based on the amount of sleep that they've obtained, which is a level 2 control. And again, there are a number of tools and technologies that sit around the potential to determine who is or who is not fit for work, and these have sometimes been referred to as prior sleep-wake rules, sleep-wake contracts, or behavioural-based safety approaches to fatigue. Again, we will go through each of the level 2 controls in order to determine which of these may or may not be appropriate for your organisation. The third level of control is about systems for identifying people exhibiting behavioural symptoms of fatigue. Many of you will have seen the recent developments in what have been referred to as the fatigue gadgets, technologies or bits of kit that enable you to identify whether somebody is fatigued. Some of these may be based on eye blinks or yawning, some of them may be based on EEG or brainwaves, but there are a range of technologies that are predicated on identifying those individuals who are exhibiting the signs and symptoms of fatigue. These could be quite complex approaches based on technology. They could be quite simple in the terms of self or peer observation. But again, we will talk about individuals who are experiencing the signs and symptoms of fatigue and the fact that they are leading indicators that provide the organisation with the opportunity to intervene before somebody actually has an accident. The last 2 layers sit within what we would call the active error phase. And what that suggests is that while the latent errors are factors which predispose the individual to an increased likelihood of an error, there are a range of factors around the actual making of an error and the actual event or incident that also provide additional opportunities for people to determine whether there is risk and how it could be controlled. If we look at the level 4 control, that is, what we are interested in is whether people make a fatigue-related error or not, or how we could control the consequences of error. You will see that there are a large number of approaches that we can use to identify whether errors are being made due to fatigue and potentially how to modify the likelihood that an error will actually translate into an adverse outcome. The last level, level 5, is where an event has actually happened, and in a sense we see the potential for a fatigue-related event to at least provide what has been euphemistically referred to as a learning opportunity to prevent it reoccurring. Taken together, each of these 5 levels provides an opportunity for the organisation to reduce the likelihood of either an imminent or a subsequent fatigue-related error. The general principle here reflects back to that error trajectory we talked about earlier and the multiple levels of defence that can be used. Level 1 controls are the first piece of the Swiss cheese. If we provide people an adequate sleep opportunity, they should be able to get enough sleep, and most of the time they should be able to be fit for duty. But sometimes that hole in the cheese will open up and the individual, for reasons that can be perfectly legitimate, up with a kid, somebody in the house is sick, a car has broken down, there can be a variety of reasons, both reasonable and sometimes unreasonable, which as a result of people aren't able to go to work in a fit state. Level 2 controls will enable you to identify those people who've been provided an adequate opportunity but weren't able to gain sufficient sleep. If you think about it, for every fatigue-related event that occurs in a workplace, there must have been an error. It is extremely likely that that individual experienced the signs and symptoms of fatigue well before the event occurred. They clearly did not get sufficient sleep or sleep of sufficient quality in order to be fit for work. And it may or may not have been the case that they were provided with an adequate opportunity. By systematically evaluating all of the leading events or the preceding events, it's possible to see that there are numerous opportunities to prevent accidents happening above and beyond the roster. So, the challenge for most organisations is to look at this as a menu. What controls are most appropriate for my organisation? Which controls are most suitable for the stage of development that my organisation is at? We'll talk a lot about this later in the course, but different controls require a different level of maturity and a different level of sophistication on behalf of the organisation to implement. There are some organisations that just don't have the wherewithal to implement good level 3 and 4 controls. Many organisations will struggle with level 2 controls, which require people to put up their hand in order to indicate that they're unfit for work. The challenge for you as the individual responsible for developing a fatigue risk management system for your organisation is to work out what is the best combination of controls that give me the most bang for my buck that I can put into play in my organisation, and what's the developmental trajectory that I could reasonably work on to implement those controls that we're not yet ready for. Unfortunately, many of the really good controls require a very mature or sophisticated organisation. It requires a good safety culture in those organisations, and some organisations frankly just don't have it. But where those organisations exist that do have that kind of culture, sometimes there's a lot of other stuff we can do beyond the roster that can help us manage the risks associated with fatigue. So your challenge over the next part of the course is to work out which of these controls are most appropriate and most relevant to my organisation now into the future, which can we best afford, and most importantly, which will give me the best bang for my buck in terms of the overall risk reduction for the organisation.